The house in Westport was ablaze with candles and garlands, but I barely noticed. My place was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, knives gleaming on the chopping board. Through the doorway, I could hear Lorelei laughing, her voice rising above the music as she welcomed guests into the living room. The guests leaned toward her, mesmerized, while I moved quietly among the roasting tins and cooking pots. It always was like that. At Thanksgiving, while other girls my age went to football games or sat on couches with their cousins, I was the one tasked with carving the turkey and filling the wine glasses. At prom, Lorelei dazzled in her new gown while I ran the appetizer platters. Even at my father's retirement dinner, my mother tapped her glass and declared that Lorelei, our star, had organized everything. Although I was doing the planning, cooking, and cleaning all by myself, my mother liked to say I was a good cook. What she meant was that I was useful there, behind the scenes. The guests came to admire Lorelei's wit, my father's golfing achievements, and my mother's impeccable hospitality. It never occurred to them to ask who kept the food warm or the glasses full. On the mantelpiece hung a framed photograph from Lorelei's engagement party. 200 guests toasted under the chandeliers while I balanced trays until my hands trembled. In the picture, Lorelei shone in her sequined gown, my parents by her side. At the far edge of the frame, I stood blurry, holding a tray of appetizers like a piece of furniture. That night in Westport, as laughter rose and I wiped butter from my palms, I felt the old weight return. The script had been written years ago, but I soon realized that the next scene wouldn't unfold as they had anticipated. In my Manhattan apartment, I meticulously folded the sweaters in my suitcase. The ticket on my desk glowed with hope, a flight to Fort Lauderdale. Departure on the evening of December 24th. My phone rang, and the word Mom appeared on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Camille began speaking in a firm tone, as if assigning tasks to the household staff. Maureen, your sister's friends are spending Christmas here, only 20 people. Before I could reply, she continued. 7 main courses and 10 side dishes. Use fine cutlery. These are pinnacle executives. Don't embarrass us. Her tone was sharp enough to break the silence of my apartment. I stared at the stack of blazers neatly arranged on my bed. To her, I was still the daughter with endless free time, a maid on call. She smiled sarcastically into the phone, reminding me of Lorelei's importance and the connections that benefited the family. If only she knew. On the counter, the gold-embossed leather folder bore the name Stellar Events. For 5 years, I had quietly built the company. 3 branches, 50 employees, and a client list that included luxury resorts and Fortune 500 companies. Tomorrow's meeting in Florida was not a whim. It was the culmination of years of strategic planning, and the contract on the table was worth $2 million. I tightened the phone. My mother quickly recited a list of suitable wines and dessert options. Unconsciously, she spoke of Pinkel, as if Lorelei might impress them, never imagining that I had already taken on the role of caterer at their resorts, and that I was about to stand before their board of directors as a colleague. When the call ended, I breathed a slow sigh of relief. I placed a neat piece of paper with the numbers of 3 emergency caterers on the counter, along with my business card. A small gesture they might overlook. I closed my suitcase and tucked the file inside. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be their secret cook. As I stowed my luggage by the door, I knew the next call wouldn't be from my family, but from the life I'd chosen. I carried my packed suitcase into the living room and placed it by the window, as the lights of Central Park flickered across the horizon. I stood for a moment, listening to the city's hum, remembering all the little insults that formed the basis of my family's story about me. Last summer, I'd driven to Westport without warning, hoping for a quiet night in my childhood room. I opened the door to find it completely transformed. The faded blue walls were still there, but the bed and bookshelves were gone. In their place, rows of clothes racks hung beneath Lorelei's sweaters and evening gowns. Boxes labeled Winter Collection filled the corners. My trophies from the debate team and the framed drawing I'd won in high school art class were packed away in boxes in the basement. When I asked, my mother barely looked up from her tablet. Lorelei needs this space. She's building her career. You don't use this room anymore. The second insult came during a dinner at the club. My father introduced Lorelei to his golf partner, saying, "She's our success story. She runs her own public relations firm in Stamford." Then he turned to me with a faint smile and said, "And this is Marin. She's looking for work." His words stung. That same morning, I had signed a $500,000 contract. My employees had celebrated with glasses of champagne. But in my father's eyes, I was still a lost soul, a child without purpose. Their narrative demanded humility from me, requiring me to justify my apartment and car. They relied on the illusion of my grandmother's savings, as if I depended on inherited wealth rather than my own hard-earned money. No one ever asked me about my work, my travels, or how I paid for my life. They didn't want answers that would challenge their perception of reality. I opened my laptop and checked my paychecks for the month, 50 salaries. Holiday bonuses approved. Suppliers paid on time. On another page, a commercial article lauded Stellar Events as a leader in fine dining. I closed the screen, stuffed the laptop into my bag, and waited for the car to John F. Kennedy Airport. The car had barely turned onto the FDR when my phone lit up again. Camille's name appeared on the screen. I almost let the call go to voicemail, but habit got the better of me. "You can't be serious," she said angrily as soon as I answered. "You told everyone you were preparing dinner. If you leave us, it will be an insult to us." Her words echoed in my ears, familiar as the clanking of old chains. She maintained a steady tone. "I have a business trip. Mom, I'm leaving tonight." "A business trip?" She laughed, a sharp, cold laugh. "Marin, stop pretending. What kind of work could you possibly do on Christmas Eve?" I didn't answer. The silence seemed to make her angrier. "You've always been selfish. Your sister's future depends on this dinner. Family comes first," I said calmly. "Family comes first when you need something from me." She gasped. Then her voice rose to a sharp tone. "If you leave, don't bother coming back." I ended the call before she could finish it. My hands trembled, but not from fear. Rather, it was a feeling closer to liberation. The phone rang again. This time it was Lorelai. "Listen," she said in a sweetly artificial tone. "If the problem is money, I'll pay you $200. Just come and cook. Please don't mess it up." She almost burst out laughing. $200. My daily wage as a personal chef was only $5,000. I said, "No." Her voice grew louder and she said, "You are dead to us if you leave." I replied, "I already was," and then hung up. The driver pulled into the departure gate at JFK. I checked in my bag and went through the check-in process without looking at my phone. Yet, as I walked toward the gate, a wave of fear washed over me. What if Naomi heard their lies before she heard the truth? What if my silence gave them too much leeway to identify me? I steeled myself as the boarding announcement echoed through the airport. I had chosen this path long before tonight. With every step down the jetway, my hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of my newfound freedom. As my plane taxied down the runway, Westport's house was crumbling. Later, I would piece together the story from letters and indirect reports, each more accurate than the last. By evening, Camille realized nothing had been prepared. The kitchen counters gleamed with untouched pots and pans. The refrigerator contained only butter and eggs, and the pantry was empty of the fancy ingredients she had been promised. She called every restaurant along Post Road from Norwalk to Fairfield, but their kitchens were closed for the holiday. Even the catering companies she had previously ignored politely declined. The silence of the empty ovens grew more pronounced with each passing minute. The guests began to arrive. They shook off the snow clinging to their coats, their voices filled with anticipation. Neighbors from Stamford, colleagues from Darien, and most importantly, Naomi Chen from Pinnacle Hospitality, were all invited into a living room shimmering with crystal and candlelight. My mother tried to stall by serving cocktails, insisting that dinner was a little late. But within an hour, Lorelai was frantically calling delivery numbers, her voice trembling as she pleaded for anything edible. Finally, a few delivery drivers appeared, their arms laden with cardboard boxes. The sight must have been unbearable for Camille, who had boasted for weeks about her daughter's culinary prowess. Nevertheless, she used silver trays and placed slices of pizza on Waterford plates as if presentation could mask failure. The air smelled not of rosemary and roast beef, but of pepperoni and grease. In a desperate attempt, Lorelai tried to persuade Naomi between bites. She cornered her near the fireplace, pointing to a sample of her PR firm's brochure, while cardboard boxes lay scattered on a mahogany side table. "We could expand your brand in the Northeast," she said, her voice trembling as another guest opened a pizza box behind her. Her cousin captured the moment on her phone. Lorelai speaking, Domino's boxes piled high on the family photo above the fireplace. In that picture, taken years ago at Lorelai's engagement party, my parents smiled as I stood in the blurry background holding a tray. Now, past and present stood side by side, revealing our true selves. The photo had already begun circulating even before the dessert was mentioned. While the residents of Westport were mired in disappointment, I was preparing for a private dinner in Fort Lauderdale. The resort gleamed with quiet elegance, its glass walls overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and its tables adorned with tablecloths that spoke of refined taste. I arrived early, reviewing my notes as the Pinnacle executives sat down. The moment Naomi Chen entered, the atmosphere shifted, and everyone lowered their voices in deference. She was shorter than I had imagined, with a sharp gaze, and she acted with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sitting down in the chair opposite me. "I just got back from a party the likes of which I've never seen." Her words were like pebbles on still water. I folded my hands, waiting patiently. It was supposed to be a Christmas Eve dinner in Connecticut. 25 guests, including executives and investors. The hostess promised a lavish meal prepared by her daughter. Naomi shook her head. We walked into an empty kitchen, flimsy excuses, and finally, pizza boxes on crystal platters. Unbelievable. A wave of laughter spread around the table, but Naomi didn't join in. She looked directly at me, as if testing whether I would tremble. I said in a calm tone, "That must have been annoying. Consistency is important. Guests remember even the smallest flaws." Her mouth curled slightly. "Exactly. And worse. The hostess spent the evening complaining about the missing daughter, describing her as unreliable and unstable. To do that in front of business partners was astonishing. My stomach churned inside, but I kept my composure. I replied, "This says more about the host than the absent guest." Naomi stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "You understand. A lot of people lose sight of professionalism when personal issues get involved." The conversation then shifted to strategy, logistics, and service quality expectations. I joined the discussion, not as a supplicant, but as a colleague, outlining the standards my company had already surpassed at other resorts. By dessert time, Naomi's earlier frustration had subsided, replaced by interest. She still didn't know that the chaos she'd witnessed was of my own making. But she saw me remain calm, offer clarity, and speak the language of solutions. In the morning, the board would demand more. Morning light streamed across the conference room table, reflecting off the polished glass and neat rows of water glasses. I stood at the front, my presentation open, my voice steady, as I briefed Naomi and her team on projections, hiring models, and event strategies. Every slide was exactly as I had rehearsed, concise, precise, and irrefutable. When I finished, a rare silence fell over the room. Then an assistant entered, carrying a tablet. "Miss Chun, you must see this." Naomi smiled intently at the screen. A picture shone on the glass, pizza boxes stacked on mahogany, a family photo hanging above them. The caption read, "When tradition fails, Papa John steps in." The image was posted on LinkedIn and had already garnered hundreds of comments. The caption read, "The Rock Family, Westport." Naomi looked at me from the tablet, then looked back at me again. "Rock," she repeated slowly. "That was your mother's house." I didn't hesitate. "Yes. Camille is my mother." Silence fell. One of the executives cleared his throat. Another put his pen down. Naomi leaned back. "Your mother told everyone last night that her daughter was untrustworthy. Yet here you are. Why should I trust you more than she trusts her own words?" I looked her in the eye. "Because results don't lie. Ask me anything about scaling up operations or risks. My record speaks louder than her story." She paused for a moment, then asked about contingency plans for a multi-resort event during hurricane season. I smoothly explained the protocols, alternative suppliers, and insurance procedures. When I finished, she sighed and closed her tablet. "That's just what I needed." She glanced around the room, then turned back to me. "Gentlemen, I believe we've found the right partner." The contract slid across the table, its gold paper bearing the Pinnacle logo gleaming. I signed with a steady hand, the ink drying as if to confirm not just a deal, but a new reality. Beyond the glass walls, the Atlantic Ocean shimmered, and I knew the call that followed would reverberate all the way to Connecticut. The ink on the contract had barely dried when Naomi excused herself, phone in hand. Through the glass wall, I watched her pace the room with quiet, deliberate steps. She pressed the call button, waited, and then said confidently, "Ms. Rock, this is Naomi Chun. I'm calling to thank you for having me last night. Unfortunately, the experience wasn't up to par, but I wanted to let you know that I've just signed a partnership agreement with your daughter, Maureen Rock, CEO of Stellar Events." Even from across the room, I could sense the silence on the other end. Naomi's expression remained unchanged as she added, "Yes, that daughter." Then she listened, nodded once, and ended the call. A moment later, my phone rang with a message from my father. "Your mother has fainted." Naomi returned to the table, put her phone down, and smiled slightly. "Shall we post this?" She took a picture of us standing with the signed contract, champagne glasses raised. Within minutes, the photo was posted on LinkedIn. "We are delighted to announce Pinnacle Hospitality's partnership with Stellar Events and its outstanding CEO, Tam Roque. We look forward to elevating guest experiences together." She had tagged my company, Pinnacle, and Camille Roque's charity page on purpose. As the meeting ended, notifications flooded in, congratulatory messages from industry leaders, inquiries from journalists, and a barrage of bewildered messages from acquaintances in Westport who had just witnessed the story's dramatic twist online. In the hierarchical world my mother had built, appearances were the currency. At luncheons, she was the patron, the woman whose daughters embodied sophistication and success. Now the very circles upon which her position depended were ignoring the unseen image of her daughter, celebrated as CEO. The narrative she had cultivated for years was crumbling before my eyes. As things worsened in Connecticut, I shut down my laptop in Florida, realizing the wave was just beginning to peak. In the weeks that followed, the consequences began to unfold. Lorelei lost two of its biggest clients, both of whom cited a conflict of values after the holiday scandal broke. Lorelai tried to justify this by claiming poor timing, but in reality, the images of the pizza boxes on Crystal Waterford had spread far more widely than she had anticipated. Camille, once a prominent member of the boards of all the charity committees in Fairfield County, was politely dismissed. The reasons were couched in terms like new direction and new leadership, but everyone knew the truth. Graham called me one evening, his voice lower than I remember. He confessed, "I should have spoken up sooner. I let your mother's story define you because it was easier than confronting her. That was cowardice. I realize that now. I was not quick to forgive him, but I realized how difficult it was for him to say that." Meanwhile, Stellar Events was making remarkable progress. Naomi was no longer just a client. She had become a supporter, opening doors to partnerships I'd never dreamed of. Within a month, I'd signed contracts totaling $10 million. Opportunities that pushed us to our limits. I hired 20 new employees and expanded the kitchen and operations teams, yet the waiting list continued to grow. 8 months during peak season, sometimes even longer. One day, I received an email from Cornell University's School of Hotel Management. They invited me to give a keynote lecture titled Building Success Without Permission. I stared at the email for a long time, remembering how my parents had described my dream of attending college as unrealistic. And now, the invitation was in my hands to accept. As my company flourished and my voice reached new heights, I realized that the applause was finally for me. However, one conversation remained unfinished. 3 months later, we met at a quiet restaurant off Columbus Avenue, away from the manicured lawns of Westport. I arrived first and placed a single note on the table. When they entered, smaller and quieter, I gestured for them to sit. I said, "These are my conditions. Mutual respect. No more subordinate roles. Public acknowledgement of my identity. Sincere apologies. Psychotherapy together and separately. Non-negotiable." Camilla's eyes filled with tears, but she did not argue. She confessed, "I was jealous. I kept you young because I couldn't bear the thought of you growing beyond the life I had planned for you." Laurel looked at her hands and said, "I was jealous. My mom made me feel special by making you invisible, and I held on to that." Graham, finally our eyes met. I chose silence. It was easier to leave your mother's story as it was than to challenge it. That made me complicit. I let their words echo before I spoke. If we rebuild, it will be on equal footing. Nothing less. They nodded, feeling embarrassed and hesitant. Weeks later, I hosted them at my apartment for the first time. The dining table overlooked Central Park, but I didn't cook. The Stellar Events team prepared and served a wonderful meal. The bills were made directly to Camille, and she signed them without complaint. Lorelai asked pointed questions about the menu, relinquishing her authority. Graham raised his glass calmly, with a touch of self-satisfaction. When the evening ended, I walked them to the door. I had one key in my hand, the only key I kept in my ring. It wasn't just the key to my apartment, it was the key to my boundaries, my choices, my life. As the door closed behind them, I knew which would stay open and which would stay closed.
अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं, ये जो दिन सहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं। तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा बेसर्द लगता है। दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दूर भरता है। अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं, ये जो दिन सुहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं। तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा सर्द लगता है। दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दर्द भरता है। मेरे साए भी मुझसे अब जुदा होने को कहते हैं। तुझे खोने की राहों में ये सितारों से भी पूछता है पता तेरा कहाँ होगा, मगर खामोश है दुनिया, कहाँ मेरा जहाँ होगा। बस एक बार मुड़ के देख ले मेरी बेबसी की सूरत, मुझे है आज भी तेरी वफा की सख्त जरूरत। साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर, साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर।